Hello friends, welcome to Midlife. Today we will be studying about the remaining tracts of the ascending tract. In the previous video we have already discussed about the 4 types of ascending tract. So today we will study about the remaining 4 tracts of the ascending tract. So first let us start with the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tract. So the function of these dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tract is that it carries the reflex action proprioceptive sensations from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. In the previous video, the 4 tracts were taking the responses or sensations from the spinal cord to the cerebrum, but the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tract will take the sensations from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. So they convey both exteroceptive, that is touch, and unconscious proprioceptive impulses. What is unconscious proprioceptive impulses? It means while we are sleeping, the posture of our body is controlled by the brain. So it arises in the Golgi tendon organ and muscle spindle to cerebellum. These are essential for the control of posture, that is coordination and movement of muscles controlling the posture of the body. Let us start with the 5th tract of the ascending tract, known as dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar tract. So it begins at the level of 3rd lumbar segment of the spinal cord. The first neuron fibers are central processes of dorsal root ganglion. That is, from the receptor site, the fibers enters first in the dorsal root ganglion, which is the first order neuron. From there it relay in the dorsal nucleus known as thoracic or Clark's column, which lies on the medial side of base of posterior gray column in these segments. After relaying in the dorsal nucleus, which is the 2nd order neuron, the fibers form dorsal spinocerebellar tract, which is uncrossed tract, and it ascends in the lateral column of white matter in the spinal cord. Then it ascends to the level of medulla oblongata, where its fiber pass through inferior cerebellar peduncle to reach finally to the cerebellum. So the dorsal tract receives information from individual muscles of the lower limb. Now let's see the pathway of dorsal spinocerebellar tract. So when the sensations from the unconscious muscle and joint is received by these fibers, they travel to the dorsal root ganglion, which is the 1st order neuron. After relaying in the dorsal root ganglion, they travel to the dorsal nucleus, also known as thoracic or Clark's column, which lies on the medial side, of base of posterior gray column of these segments, which is the 2nd order neuron. After relaying in the dorsal nucleus, this 2nd order neuron forms the spinocerebellar tract, which ascends in the lateral column of white matter and this dorsal spinocerebellar tract remains uncrossed. After ascending in the lateral column of white matter in the spinal cord, it ascends to the level of medulla oblongata, where its fiber pass through the inferior cerebellar peduncle of the cerebellum, and finally it reaches to cerebellum. So this was all about dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar tract. Now let's study about the ventral or anterior spinocerebellar tract. So when the fiber receives sensations, it travels to the dorsal root ganglion, which is the first order neuron, and these are the central processes of dorsal root ganglion. After relaying in the dorsal root ganglion, these fibers travel to the second order neuron, which are derived from large cells of posterior gray column in the segment L1 to S5. The second order neuron fibers cross to opposite side and ascend in the lateral white column of spinal cord, which is anterior to the fibers of dorsal spinocerebellar tract, to pass through medulla oblongata and pons. And finally, they pass through superior cerebellar peduncle to reach to the cerebellum. So the functions of these ventral or anterior spinocerebellar tract is that it conveys muscle and joint information from the entire lower limb. The important thing is that in the dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar tract, the tracts were uncrossed, while in the ventral or anterior spinocerebellar tract, the fibers are crossed. Now let's see about the spinoolivary and spinotectal tract. These tracts are responsible for proprioceptive and visual reflexes. This much information is only for the spinoolivary and spinotectal tract because these are least important. So now let's first see the pathway for ventral or anterior spinocerebellar tract, then we will see about the intersegmental tract and some sensory receptors. Now let's see the pathway of ventral spinocerebellar tract. So when this tract receives sensations from the unconscious muscle and joint, it travels first to the dorsal root ganglion, which is the first order neuron. After relaying in the dorsal root ganglion, these fibers travels to the posterior gray column or dorsal root of the spinal cord in the segment L1 to S5. So this posterior gray column is the second neuron fibers, and these fibers cross to the opposite side and ascend in the lateral white column of the spinal cord anterior to the fibers of dorsal spinocerebellar tract to pass through medulla oblongata and pons, and finally they pass through the superior cerebellar peduncle to reach to the cerebellum. So this was all about the pathway of anterior spinocerebellar tract. We have completed about the ascending tracts. Now let us start with the intersegmental tract. So what is intersegmental tract? These are the fibers connecting various segments of the spinal cord present in anterior, posterior and lateral columns of white matter adjacent to gray matter of the spinal cord. Tract of Lisser is also an intersegmental tract. Now let's start with other topic that is known as sensory receptors. So these are the peripheral endings of afferent fibers. So what is afferent fibers? It is the fibers which takes the sensations from the receptor side to the brain. So the sensory receptors are the peripheral endings of the afferent fibers which receive impulses and known as receptors. And the functional classification of sensory receptors are as follows. First, exteroceptors. So the exteroceptors respond to stimuli from external environment, that is pain, temperature, touch and pressure. Second one is proprioceptors, which respond to stimuli in deeper tissues, that is contraction of muscles, movements, position and pressure related to joints. These are responsible for coordination of muscles, maintenance of body posture and equilibrium. These actions are perceived both at unconscious and conscious level. Third one is interoceptors, which include receptor from end organs in the wall of viscera, gland, blood vessels and specialized structures in the carotid sinus, carotid bodies and osmoreceptors. These also carry sensation of hunger, nausea and pain. Fourth one is spatial sense receptors. These are concerned with vision, hearing, smell, balance and taste. So this was all about today. Please like, share and subscribe for more videos of neuroanatomy. Thank you.